In August 1976, Don Merton's team climbs the sheer face of Little Monger Island. The fate of an entire species hinges on what they find at the top. The black robin is a tiny, all-black bird. It flies poorly, has almost no fear of humans, and spends its whole life close to the ground. The last count was supposed to find 9 birds. The team counts 7. Only 2 are female. Only one of those is fertile. The band on her leg was blue. They named her Old Blue, and it is this rescue that would launch the riskiest bird conservation project in New Zealand's history. The black robin had never feared the ground. For thousands of years on the Chatham Islands, no predator existed that could reach a nest just 1 meter off the soil. The bird grew used to that quiet. It became trusting, slow, barely able to fly, and had no reason to be anything else. Then ships arrived, and with them came cats and rats. They spread through the forest faster than anyone noticed. By 1871, the species had vanished from the main island of the archipelago, 90,000 hectares of forest that had suddenly become a death trap. Within a few decades, it disappeared from every other island except one. What remained was Little Monger, 9 hectares of rock, unreachable for predators precisely because it was unreachable for people. For the next 9 decades, science simply fell silent on this bird. Only in 1938 did 2 students, Charles Fleming and Graham Turbot, risk a dangerous climb up that same rock and found 25 to 35 pairs there. That was the entire world population of the species. 3 more decades passed before Merton saw the bird alive for the first time in 1968. By then, about 30 birds remained, and every count after that came in worse than the one before. 18 in 1972, 11 in 1975. The species was vanishing right in front of the people who had come to save it. One count from that period stuck with the team for years. In 1972, Merton led an expedition across the short but rough channel between Monger and Little Monger in an old 3-meter aluminum boat with a hole in the bottom. Nobody had a life jacket. Water poured straight in through the hole, but the team made it across without incident and counted 26 birds. It felt like some kind of stability. A year later, it turned out that 4 of the 9 tagged birds had vanished over the winter, and the team could only guess that a similar share had disappeared among the untagged ones too. Each season, the young birds barely managed to replace the ones that died. Meanwhile, the forest at the top of the rock was falling apart. Wild vines were spreading over the tree canopies and blocking the light. The birds were losing the last scrap of forest where they could feed. Saving the species from this decline fell to a man who had grown up surrounded by birds himself, though at the time, not even he could have predicted it. Don Merton was born in Devonport in 1939 and grew up in Wainui Beach. At school, they called him Bird Brain. He searched for nests instead of playing football. As a child, he used to pick up stranded goldfinch chicks on the beach and slip them under his grandmother's canary. The canary raised them without ever questioning whose chicks they were. 35 years later, that childhood game would become the technology that saved a species. But there was a long road of preparation before that. In January 1973, Merton returned to the Chathams with an experienced climber who fixed a custom-built 5-meter ladder and a system of safety ropes to the sheer face of Little Monger. The climb got easier, but, according to those who were there, no less terrifying. On that same visit, the team got bad news. In a single year, the population had dropped from 26 to a far smaller number, and the team could only guess at the real toll since they could only count the birds they actually spotted. Merton pushed hard for an immediate transfer of the birds to the nearby larger island of Monger. He was turned down. The bureaucracy dragged on for years, until 1976, when only 9 birds were left, permission was finally granted. Even then, the team was only authorized to move a single breeding pair. The process itself seemed too risky. When the catching team reached the rock that summer, they didn't find 9 birds. They found 7, 2 females, and a decision had to be made on the spot. With only 2 breeding pairs left for the entire species, leaving the second pair behind on a crumbling rock was no longer a risk anyone could justify. The permit was expanded in the field, and both pairs were taken off the island. The descent from the rock happened in stages. The first pair, Old Blue and her partner at the time, was caught and lowered in a special transport box down the 200-meter cliff face. A storm delayed the capture of the second pair by several days. Once the weather cleared, the second pair and a single unpaired male were also lowered and carried across the rough channel to Mongere. 2 more lone males remained on the rock and weren't brought over until the following spring. A cameraman filming one of the later transfers described watching the rescuers themselves change in the moment a box with a bird inside landed in their hands. People became different, suddenly aware of the weight of what they were holding. But that weight in their hands was no guarantee of a life on the new island. The first season on the new island was a harsh reminder that relocation alone guaranteed nothing. One of the males vanished without a trace. But one pair did raise a chick that survived to adulthood, the first living proof that Mongere could sustain the species. It was a thin thread of confirmation, but a necessary one. Rescuing the birds from the rock only mattered if the new home would actually let them breed. Still, that didn't save the numbers. By 1980, only 5 birds remained. The team returned to Mongere that season and found a simple picture. One young chick belonging to Old Blue and Old Yellow was already flying. Nearby was another nest belonging to the pair Green and White, White being Old Blue's former partner. But that pair turned out to be unstable, and its offspring wouldn't matter much for the species' future. Only one pair was capable of producing fertile eggs. Old Blue and her longtime partner. The first eggs that season turned out to be empty. Black robins are monogamous for life. Switching partners is almost a biological anomaly for this species. Old Blue did it anyway. She left her original partner and chose a younger male with a pale yellow band. Old Yellow. Her next clutch was fertile. It was during these years that Merton noticed a detail that would become the key to the entire method. One pair lost their nest in a storm, and instead of skipping the season, immediately started building a new one and laying again. If you take the eggs away, the birds don't give up. They try again. From that observation came a solution that came from no textbook. Merton began taking eggs directly from Old Blue's nest and placing them in the nest of another bird, the Chatham Island warbler. The logic was simple. A robin left without eggs will lay new ones. And while she lays her new clutch, the warbler incubates and raises the old one. The first attempt failed. The warbler hatched the eggs, but the chicks didn't survive to adulthood. The food the warbler brought wasn't suited to robin chicks. The 1981 season brought 5 birds again: Old Blue, Old Yellow, another pair, and the previous year's chick. The team switched foster species to the Chatham Island tomtit on the neighboring island of Rangatira. Every egg now traveled across open water by boat. The tomtit succeeded. Old Blue, finding her nest empty, laid again and again. In a single season, she produced 3 clutches. The method started working, and working fast. Every saved clutch meant several more chicks than the species would have produced naturally that same year. Season after season, the number crept upward. By the mid-1980s, the islands held several dozen birds. In 1983, the team established a second permanent population on the neighboring island of Rangatira. The species was no longer dependent on a single patch of forest. Old Blue herself was moved there that same year. She was last seen alive on November 30th, 1983, in sunlit forest, looking perfectly healthy. She was spotted once more on December 13th. Never again after that. She was at least 13, possibly over 14 years old, roughly 3 times a robin's average lifespan. There had once been talk of preserving her as a museum specimen in the event of her death, but it never came to that. She simply vanished into the forest, the way the rest of her species lives, unnoticed. Old Blue remains the only bird whose death was ever formally announced in New Zealand's parliament. November 29, 1989. Merton was on the Chatham Islands when that season's count came in. He called his wife Margaret in Upper Hutt on the radiophone. "And it's all down to one fertile female, Old Blue," he said. "I feel the black robin is now out of danger." That season's count showed 53 adults and 56 new chicks. By then, she had already done her work. 6 chicks from her and Old Yellow became the founders of everything that followed. By the end of intensive management in 1989, the population had passed 100 birds. All of them descended from the 6 chicks that Old Blue and Old Yellow managed to raise in the final seasons of her life. In 1990, cross-fostering was stopped for good. The birds were left to breed on their own. The method Merton built became known as close order management. Every bird with its own band, known parents, known nest. Managing each individual animal, because once only 5 birds remain, there is no such thing as a population anymore. There are only individual animals, and not one of them can be lost. The method itself produced a side effect the team had not anticipated. Chicks raised by tomtits sometimes grew up convinced they were tomtits themselves and tried to pair with the wrong species. The team caught the problem and separated the young birds before it spiraled out of control. In 2016, geneticists led by Melanie Massaro confirmed that one hybrid pair had indeed formed and produced offspring. While the team fought for every egg on the rocks, the whole country was learning about it too. New Zealand's Natural History Film Unit produced 3 documentaries about the project: 7 Black Robins in 1981, The Robin's Return in 1983, and a follow-up version in 1987 that updated the story through that year. Merton later said himself that these films drove an unprecedented rise in public and political interest in conservation throughout the decade. Old Blue, a tiny black bird with a blue band, became the recognizable face of a national movement that simply had not existed at that scale before. By 1998, the population had reached nearly 200 birds. Within another year, it had passed that mark for good. The method tested on the black robin became a template used around the world. The same intensive, name-by-name approach to individual birds was later applied by Merton himself on a new front, the rescue of the kakapo, as well as to the Seychelles magpie robin on islands in the Indian Ocean, and to the noisy scrub bird in Australia. In each case, the same idea held. Once a species drops to a few dozen individuals, there is no population left, only specific animals with names, and each one has to be known personally. Merton himself never returned to the robin as his main focus. The kakapo was waiting, the hardest project of his career. In 1992, Massey University awarded him an honorary doctorate for his contribution to science, and that same year, he and researcher David Butler published the book The Black Robin, Saving the World's Most Endangered Bird, a detailed, unvarnished account from the inside of every decision made on that rock and afterward. The book remains a primary source that researchers still draw on when publishing new studies on the species 4 decades later. He retired from the Department of Conservation in 2005, settled in Tauranga, and stayed active in local conservation work into his final years. Colleagues called him the guru of the conservation movement, a man whose legacy lives on in populations of species that simply would not exist today without him. A few months after his death, the Department of Conservation established an award in his name for young researchers taking their first steps in the same work he began as a boy with a canary on a beach. But the method that saved the species was not free of cost. Around 1984, researchers began noticing that some females were laying eggs not in the center of the nest, but on the rim of the cup. An egg on the rim cools and fails to hatch. The team, with the best of intentions, kept moving the eggs back to the center. The habit spread. By 1989, more than half the females were laying this way. A 2013 study by Melanie Massaro in PLOS1 identified the cause: a dominant gene, inherited along the line of one of the species' founders, Old Blue's own line. Every egg saved from the rim of the nest passed that gene on. Only once the team stopped rescuing those eggs and let natural selection cull the trait did the share of such females drop, down to 9% by 2011. The most powerful rescue tool turned out to be the simplest one: knowing when to step back. A deeper wound remains too. Every black robin alive today descends from 6 chicks born to a single pair. The degree of relatedness in the population is among the highest ever recorded for any wild bird. Any new disease could strike every individual at once, because genetically they are almost the same animal. It was this very vulnerability that pushed the team toward a new step. In September 2022, researchers from Massey University and the Department of Conservation went to Rangatira to catch and transfer 10 females to Mangaree, where the population was shrinking and risked functional extinction within 4 years if nothing changed. According to a model built by researcher Liz Parlato, this exact relocation was meant to be the lifeline. Emeritus Professor Doug Armstrong, who took part in the capture, has worked on species translocation for 30 years, and this was his first trip to the Chathams. "It was a moment I'd dreamed of my whole life," he said. 7 of the 10 relocated females settled successfully on the new island and are regularly recorded by the monitoring team. That same year, 2022, the IUCN Red List moved the species from endangered to vulnerable. In New Zealand, the bird is still classified as nationally critical, the country's highest threat category. As of August 2025, the population stands at 445 individuals, and that single number actually tells 2 opposite stories. On Rangatira, there are roughly 400 birds, and the forest's carrying capacity is nearly maxed out. On Mangaree, there are only 45, and that number is still at risk. Too few females survive the winter, and too little forest has regrown after half a century of plantings. The species exists on 2 small islands totaling just over 3 square kilometers. It can't colonize new territory on its own, it's too weak a flyer. Every future home it has will have to be carried there by human hands. There has already been one such attempt. The team's first step beyond Mangaree and Rangatira came a few years ago, and it failed. Establishing a third population in a fenced sanctuary on Pitt Island had to be written off as unsuccessful, likely because introduced mice were taking the robin's food faster than the team could counter it. New sites are now being prepared on Chatham Island itself and on Pitt, but before a single bird can be moved there, those areas have to be completely cleared of predators. In March 2026, that groundwork took its first real step forward. The predator-free Chatham's pilot project launched on the main island of Chatham, clearing 7,500 hectares of land in the island's northeast of predators. For now, this isn't specifically about the robin, it's about the wider network of species living across the archipelago. But exactly this kind of land, fully cleared of rats, mice, and cats, is something the black robin has never managed to gain anywhere beyond its 2 tiny islands. If the project manages to expand, the path to Chatham and Pitt will, for the first time in half a century, stop being just a plan on the pages of future reports. And then there's the island the team speaks of with particular care, Little Mangaree, the very rock where the species held on for 90 years and from which Merton carried off the last 7. The vegetation there has finally begun regrowing on its own without any human hand. Someday, perhaps, the black robin will return to the place it was carried away from, not because it needs to, but because it would mean the circle has closed.